Hello, in this lecture, I'm going to talk about skeletal muscle physiology, and it should be totally review from what you've already covered in your anatomy and physiology courses. I just want to bring this back up again because it will be relevant in terms of understanding how muscles work and how they contract and produce force and what they're made of in our study of biomechanics. Okay, so a muscle fiber is equivalent to a muscle cell. So both terms are used interchangeably and they mean exactly the same thing. Every muscle fiber is covered by an endomysium, which is made of connective tissues. That's the connective tissue covering of the muscle fiber. Then if we bundle several muscle fibers together, so 10 to 100 muscle fibers together, we call that bundle a fascicle. And that fascicle, that bundle, is covered by a paramecium. Again, that's a connective tissue covering. Then we take many fascicles and bundle those together to create a whole muscle. And then that whole muscle is covered by epimysium. Okay, so on the small level, we have a muscle fiber, then bundles of muscle fibers are fascicles, bundles of fascicles are whole muscles, and at each layer or at each level, we have connective tissue covering the muscle fiber, the fascicle, and then the whole muscle. So a tendon, classically, we define that as connective tissue that is connecting the muscle to the bone. But I'm personally not a huge fan of that definition because it doesn't take into consideration that it's really an extension of the muscle and blends right into the bone. It makes it sound like the tendon is its own distinct structure, but really it's just an extension of the endomysium, paramecium, and the endomysium, paramecium, and epimysium that are part of the belly of the muscle. It's just that those layers of connective tissue continue beyond where the end of the muscle fibers are. So the muscle fibers end, and that ends the belly of the muscle, but the connective tissue continues on and forms the tendon. And that tendon is made mostly of collagen, and there's an enormous amount of collagen in the bone too. And so that collagen, that tendon, is then blending into the connective tissue that makes up the bone. And that's why that connection between tendon and bone is so strong, is because those tissues are sort of blending together and at their attachment. It's not like we took a rubber band and hooked it onto a hook on the bone. It's blended right in. So the tendon really blends seamlessly with the muscle because it's an extension of the same tissue, and then it blends seamlessly into the bone. Skeletal muscle has a rich nerve and blood supply. So, of course, it's extremely metabolically active tissue. It's got a lot of work to do, requires an enormous amount of energy and oxygen to do all of its work, and it produces a lot of waste products. So, we need a lot of blood supply to be able to carry resources to the muscles and clean away the waste products afterwards. And then it has a lot of nerve supply, of course, because we need to be able to control our muscles. We need a lot of sensory motor control. So we need to be able to bring sensory information back from the muscles and tendons and ligaments to give an idea of where we are in space and how we're moving and how effective our movement plans are. And of course, we need a heavy motor supply because our muscles are the primary effectors in the body, meaning the primary things that respond to our motor commands to create movement. Each muscle fiber is supplied by one motor neuron, and each motor neuron supplies many muscle fibers. Okay, so we'll talk a lot more about motor units later on, but just a brief mention here is a motor unit is the motor neuron and all of the fibers that it innervates. Okay, so every muscle fiber is controlled by only one neuron, but each motor neuron controls many muscle fibers. Okay, so we'll review that again later on when we talk more about motor units. All right, so this picture looks very similar to the one we were just looking at, but now we are way zoomed in. So we were looking at a whole muscle divided into fascicles and fascicles divided into muscle fibers. This is one muscle fiber. and we're looking at what is happening inside of one muscle fiber. So the organization looks exactly the same as what we just saw, but we are way zoomed in compared to the last picture. So I just want to go over a couple terms here, a couple of structures within the muscle fiber. The sarcolemma is the fancy name for the cell membrane of a muscle fiber. So a muscle fiber is a cell, has all the same usual organelles and structures as other types of cells, like that you might have learned about in biology class, or maybe you covered in A&P. But we give them some of the structures fancy names for being in muscle cells. Anything starting with sarco is referring to muscle tissue. Okay, so sarcolemma, the cell membrane. Sarcoplasm is the same thing as cytoplasm in any generic cell, but sarcoplasm, that's the intracellular fluid inside of a muscle fiber. And then in a muscle fiber, there are several nuclei and many mitochondria. So we have several nuclei because a muscle fiber can be a foot long. A muscle fiber can be very long, and we can't just have one nucleus somewhere in the middle. We need to have multiple nuclei because the cell is so large, it is such a long cell that we need to have nuclei scattered throughout to be able to perform all their functions. Same goes for mitochondria. Mitochondria, of course, being the powerhouse of the cell. Where do we need more power than in a muscle fiber? So not only is the cell very long, and we don't want to wait for things to travel to and from the mitochondria, but also we need an enormous amount of energy to supply the functions of the muscle fiber. So we have many mitochondria. And that's actually an adaptation to endurance exercise, is called mitochondrial density. And that's referring to how many mitochondria we have within a tissue. So that will adapt depending on what we ask the muscles to do. So if we're engaging in a lot of endurance activities, like you see this in cyclists, for example, cyclists and runners, with proper training, they will increase their mitochondrial density in the muscles that they're using for endurance. So like in cyclists, you'll see that in the lower extremities, that they'll have more mitochondria grow within the same muscles than what they had before. And that helps make those muscles that they're using very heavily be more able to generate ATP by using oxygen and glucose. And so that's very specific. That's part of why our adaptations to exercise are so extremely specific to the activity, is that's very specific to the muscles that we are making those demands on. So we'll see in a cyclist, we'll see those adaptations like in the quads and the hamstrings and the calves, but you're not going to see that in the upper body. So it's not a systemic adaptation, it's a local adaptation in the muscles that we're using. So a myofibril is a cylindrical structure composed of many sarcomeres arranged end to end. So in this picture, that's what we're seeing here that are being pulled out, these whole straw-like structures that are sort of bundled together here. Each of those sort of straws in the bundle is a myofibril, and the myofibril is made up of sarcomeres that are end to end to end, going all the way the length of the fiber. Transverse tubules are abbreviated as T-tubules. I would like you to know the full term and the abbreviation. They extend from the cell membrane transversely, that's where it gets its name, to reach the deepest myofibrils in the muscle fiber. Okay, so the T-tubules is the system of tubes. In the picture, they're these sort of bluish tubes, and they're going transversely across the width and into the depth of the muscle fiber, so that it can deliver the calcium ions throughout the whole muscle fiber when there's a signal to contract. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is the same thing as the endoplasmic reticulum in a generic cell model, but in a muscle we call it the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and this is where we store calcium ions when there is no signal to contract. So in the absence of a muscle contraction, the calcium ions are stored inside of the sarcoplasmic reticulum so that when there is a signal to contract, they can be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and it will flood the cell and cause the sarcomeres to shorten. We'll get to that in another video. Okay, and then myoglobin is very closely related to hemoglobin. So also red pigment, just like hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is larger and can bind to more oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules. Myoglobin is smaller. And myoglobin has its name, myo, for muscle, because it lives just locally inside of a muscle cell. So it's sort of like hemoglobin, but that only lives inside the muscle. So it's myoglobin. And its job is really just to bind to oxygen and store it inside the muscle fiber. So that way, when we need contraction of that muscle fiber and it requires oxygen to produce ATP, at least more efficiently than when we don't use oxygen, we have a little bit of oxygen stored there for immediate use. And then we'll need to replenish that from the blood supply. So the myoglobin stays in the sarcoplasm to provide oxygen early during contraction. And it's not a lot, so we do use that up pretty quickly. Okay, that's all I have for you in this lecture, and I'll see you for the next one.